tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So last week we talked about letting go as the healing of patterns. We're healing sankharas and cravings. And I opened us into this model where you can think of a body that's doing this practicing of the Dhamma and this healing as not just the individual body that we know, but a body as a coherent, defined set or collection or communal body of beings. And so the layers that I use, and these are, all borders are fiction. So the borders between these layers are somewhat fictional, but they are useful enough, recognizable common layers. This isn't entirely unique to me, but this is the way that I use this, is I use body in the individual sense, and then family. That could be blood family or, social family. But then community is more like an affinity group community, larger than a family of blood or chosen family. Individual, family, community, and then culture. That's the kind of national or societal level. Mostly cultures nowadays are transnational. Um, and then, and then, um, and then, um, and then maybe species you can use, and then ecosystem. I've just been dropping species in recently as I have felt myself part of the human family or the human body and in a relationship with other species bodies. But mostly I think about, the individual body, the family body. Sometimes if we're talking about community dynamics, we'll talk in that realm. But for the large isms, for the big forces that create the structures, most often the structures of oppression, but also the big defining structures and worldviews, we're really talking at the cultural level. So I want to think together tonight some more about a culture as a certain kind of individual or a certain kind of sentient being, let's say, and how do we think about practice in relation to this thing? Mostly when we talk about activism and engaged practice and organizing, we still default to the core worldview that the individual that is making choices and doing actions is the bodily individual, the individual subject under capitalism, and that organizing consists of, figuring out ways to get together individuals into community groups, into collectives, to amplify individual voices through, action and voting and a ton of other things to affect the cultural body. So this is one way where we most conventionally think about the relationship between the individual person and the collective person. So that's, in a very practical way, what we do much of the time, right? You can't convince a culture to, um, do something as easily as you can convince an individual to do something. But I want to think about the cultural body as a kind of individual and think about what are the kinds of practices, but also what are the kinds of patterns and ailments, sicknesses, actions, intentions essentially anything I can think about an individual body doing, I want to think about a culture doing, and then what are some examples of that? This is all in the way to say, how do we think about not just organizing to contain, stop, redirect, change an oppressive pattern in the culture. How do we stop fascism or authoritarianism, or you know, um, do harm reduction in relation to capitalism or individualism or any of the other big forces that cause so much trouble in the world? How do we think about those things as hindrances, as poisons, as manifestations of the great poisons of greed, hatred, and delusion in the world? And how the cultural body might practice in relation to it. What would it mean for a culture to be a Dhamma practitioner? And maybe in one obvious or like surface level way, there's the way that you know um, that a culture can be in a literal way, like a Buddhist culture, like Thailand right now, which is still something like 95% Buddhist. It's one of the only countries with that high of a percentage. Burma or Myanmar has a very large Muslim population right now. Um, China, of course, is part Buddhist, part Taoist, part I'm not sure what I am because the communists outlawed religion for, you know, 70 years or something, 60 years, and everyone's still figuring out what to do, you know. Um, uh, uh, so in all of the different places where Buddhism has been established, there's some way that the Dharma has become core to the culture, to varying degrees. So maybe in part, we could look to, Buddhist cultures to say, how does a culture that has at least historically held the Dhamma very centrally, how does it behave? And I'm thinking here of an anecdote uh, that many of us love about the radical Thai reformer monk Ajahn Buddhadasa in the late 1960s into the 70s, who was teaching a very clear, austere form of forest style Buddhism. And Thailand was going into its big leap toward capitalism and a kind of a consumer industrial economy. They were really modernizing, and the government was putting a lot of effort toward modernizing, but particularly taking on the the consumer culture in a certain way. And there famously is a process at one point where the government influences the kind of monastic um, authorities to ask prominent preaching monks to de-emphasize contentment in the Dharma teachings, to de-emphasize letting go and equanimity and contentment, because it was clear that you know in a very faithful Buddhist population, if people are really practicing this core uh, concept, right, of not taking more than you need, and not accumulating possessions, like having a renunciate approach um, to material life, that like the consumer economy wasn't really going to take off in this place. And um, it's one of those stories that's like simultaneous. It's sort of like funny painful, because the because the government who's trying to make this happen, the businesses essentially that were trying to make this happen, they knew exactly what they were doing. They could totally tell that it wasn't it wasn't just that the religious beliefs were a kind of like a comfort for people, but that they would, respond to advertising in the way that they should. They could really tell actually that the teachings on contentment and getting by with less, um, were a hindrance to the consumer life. I remember also in sometime in the mid or early 90s, I saw a story about a study that had been done by some consortium of advertisers. And this was in Europe and the West, but um, uh, they were talking about my generation and a certain subset of my kind of Gen X-y kind of generation that was kind of like non-cooperative with the consumer life. And they were talking about like young people who don't seem to be committed to either earning a proper income or spending that proper income, and that there was a kind of problematic gap in the flow of consumers through the culture, and this was to be worried about. And I was a little bit like, it's my people not buying enough, you know, and the powers that be are worried. Um, so, uh, so on the cultural level, how does a culture practice, let's say, renunciation? You know, what are the ways? What are some ways on the level of let's say global culture right now, where you can see um, what we would call like the practice of renunciation, which would be something like I could have more of a thing, but I'm intentionally not doing so because I can see that it's harmful. So renunciation isn't just like, you know, I'm outlawing, like maybe there's some of the examples are of, like the law comes in to do renunciation, like arms limitation treaties. When the world comes together and says, look, that was really bad, nuclear weapons, let's try to make sure they don't ever get used again. And so there's all of these nuclear arms control structures that have worked more or less uh, to contain the spread and the use of nuclear weapons. So that's a kind of restraint. That's a kind of will-based restraint. You know, that's the kind of like, I really wish I had a stick to hit my neighbor that I don't like with, but mom says no sticks, so I guess I can't have a stick. Like, I wish I had one, but I don't. So there's that kind of renunciation. Um, you know, then there's the kind that's like something is unhealthy, and a lot of us agree that it's unhealthy, and there's a combination of law that changes the norms, but then there's also like a cultural movement. And I'm thinking like the movement away from smoking that happened at a certain point, and that's swinging back, by the way. I hear millennials and Z's are smoking again. I don't know. Tell me, millennials, why would you do that? It's so disgusting, but there you go. There's a movement away from smoking, and there's both a kind of regulation aspect but there's also a kind of view aspect, right? If a lot of people feel like a thing is just not that good. I think this might be happening a little bit right now with alcohol. There's a huge downturn in alcohol, and maybe it correlates with an upturn in cannabis, but um, that's been speculated by some. Um, but like the wine industry is kind of tanking at the moment. So, and I don't drink wine. I'm a little like good riddance. It's not my drug of choice. But um, but there is a sense that some of this is a thing that we might call a kind of cultural level, a kind of renunciate impulse in the cultural body. Like, this isn't really good for us. We don't really like it. We don't really like the culture that was around it. And so we're just not going to do that. So that's a couple of ideas around, let's say, renunciation. On the ethical front, like keeping the precepts. As an individual, I try to keep the precepts. sometimes I really want to do something and I make myself not do it. You know, I want to say a thing that's kind of mean, or I want to, you know, flirt with a person, or I want to hit somebody or something because I'm angry, and I have a vow not to do these things in a way that's unskillful. So then I don't do it. So there's that. There's will-based renunciation in an ethical way. So we have a whole system of law and order to do that. So that's to the extent that law and order is wholesome, it's wholesome in restraining unethical action. So that's one aspect. But of course, the maturing of sila, of ethics as a practice, is really in the letting go. Not that I'm like, not that I like have to tell myself every day to not go around hitting people, but that I've matured and understood my emotions and my impulses and my relationships and my suffering in a way that I actually am not inspired to hit people. Like hitting someone doesn't occur to me intuitively to be the right response to dukkha, to dissatisfaction. I'm unsatisfied with people a lot, but it doesn't occur to me to hit them, right? I can tell in my heart if I even suggest to myself the idea that it's way more trouble than it's worth, right? It's both not going to work and it's going to make more trouble. So in the cultural body, where are the places where, broadly, you might sometimes we could look at crime statistics and think about things like, okay, the punitive restraint of crime is working, but there's also just the way that, like crime is down across the metrics right now, across the board. That's not because we live in a police state, to the extent that we do, and in part we do, but that's not, I think, the reason why crime is down overall. That there's reflections around just a shift in culture, a shift in general safety, a general lifting of poverty levels, um, and just changing norms around the the social acceptability of violence, um, and I think I could think about this as a kind of, well, there's a kind of ethic that is um, returning or growing in the larger body, and that we could say, oh, I want to encourage that. Like, I like that, and um, and maybe you see, I mean, I see, one of the things that I notice, because I have a kid and I'm with them all the time, and I see everything that they read. One thing that I notice is that, modern kid heroes, this has been true since the mid-century, I think. Um, but um, but it's almost a universal constant in kids literature and shows right now, which is that the heroes in young people's literature almost never themselves intentionally hurt or kill someone, right? Like, um, you know, Harry Potter only uses the disarming spell. Um, you know, Percy Jackson never like intentionally says like, um, Percy Jackson actually does kill a couple things in there, but it's never humans, right? It's always like, easy to kill demonic figures. Um, this has been true in a certain way since Tolkien, and even before. The problem of evil in Tolkien, the deep problem of representation in Tolkien, and in a certain way, racism and genocide in Tolkien, is that he never solved, and he anguished about this for his whole life. He never solved the problem of who the orcs are, because if the orcs are an actual species that has feelings and has a soul and has families, um, then they can't actually be just faceless soldiers that you can massacre without guilt. He was deeply Christian, and he really worried about this, and it's in a certain way, in a kind of philosophical and ethical way, I think it's the deepest flaw in that kind of literature, that you have to create a kind of inhuman enemy to kill. Um, the the kids book. I was really into this kids book, Ender's Game, when I was a teenager in the 80s, and the hero in it is a young kid who is trained to be a warrior, and in the end thinks that he's doing his sort of final test, which is a big video game, but he's actually really directing the army in space to attack the planet of these insect beings who invaded the Earth at one point, and he wins by destroying the entire planet and committing this enormous genocide. And only after he's won and saved the Earth from this race of beings is he told that it was real. And then, to the author's credit, who happens to be a devout Mormon, and there's interesting threads of mystical Christianity throughout these books. To the author's credit, he spends the next couple books carrying around a tiny chrysalis of a new hive queen and having a telepathic relationship with the queen of these insect beings, and working to reestablish them on a new planet and make amends for this genocide that he did. And so I'm remembering these things partly as a way to think about how deep worldviews change in a culture over time. You know, that uh, who are our heroes now, and what do they do? You know, and you might look, broadly at the entertainment landscape, the cultural story landscape, and ask, what are the morals, what are the principles being taught in this story landscape? Um, there's a comment in chat around the sources of violence in individuals being whether that one of the strong conditions and correlations is whether a person has had violence inflicted upon them, of course, right? And we can see this in the larger cultural context as well, very much in the behavior of both nation groups and ethnic groups, where groups that have been the victims of terrible violence often, shortly or generations later, um, find themselves as the aggressors and the oppressors and those inflicting violence. And very often in ethnic and sectarian conflict, you see this kind of, traumatic replay of cataclysmic violence playing out. And it's very hard to stop those cycles, right? I've told a story many times about a friend of mine here, a dear friend and practitioner who um, was doing deep therapeutic work, and uh, and really came to a clear understanding in themselves uh, around their history as having been abused as a child, and recognizing that their father was abused as a child by their grandfather, and the grandfather was abused. They knew enough of their family history to know that this physical abuse of a male child was at least 4 generations old, and um, and they had a son, and expressed in this most moving way the recognition that they carried this karma, this the force of this um, generational kind of ghost, and they made the vow that I think is such a beautiful renunciation, you know to say, like, it stops here, it stops with me. That ghost is in my body, and I won't pass that ghost on to my child. And that's the that and that's not just a kind of willful, oh, I think I shouldn't hit my child, so I'm going to try not to do that. That's really a kind of letting go and healing that takes very deep wisdom to come to. What's that, love? I'll I'll be very gentle with her. I won't. Our little dog had a had a a vaccine shot today, and she's coming in looking for comfort. So I was just given instructions on how gentle I should be with her. So she's right here. Okay, sweetheart. So all of these examples for me are pointing toward how do we think about the whole culture as a practitioner, right? As a kind of being that can practice. Do you want to come over? I have a very scared little dog right here. And what is a vow on the cultural level? And when as a cultural body we find ourselves present with something as intense as the like a resurgence of an impulse toward authoritarianism or sectarian violence or a calcification of bias in the culture. Can we think of it as the culture becoming like those of us that can recognize it for what it is? Let's say there's a part of a culture that has a kind of mindfulness or a kind of conscience, right? Folks, when you start to see story after conversation recognizing, we're in a moment of the arising of fascism or the growth or the degradation of democratic norms, or the fracturing of a kind of rules-based order. We see evidence of this. Let's say this is on a culture, in the cultural body, this is a kind of mindfulness of a hindrance arising. So, and maybe the hindrance is a kind of like, let's say if it was me as the individual, I might notice like, oh, I'm in an emotion or a mind state. I'm in a whole state where I feel really controlling and violent toward myself. I'm using harsh language toward myself, but very much toward others, right? And I'm doing things to try to really control or constrain the experience here. I could be mindful of that as a state, as a mind state. So as a cultural body, we are now mindful of this state having become quite strong, in the culture. Upon becoming mindful of a toxic state, right, of a deep hindrance manifesting in the body, what do we then do as practitioners? Right? If I notice I'm in that kind of really intense emotional state in myself, what would I do? I would want to use mindfulness to be aware of it. I would want to bring in some self-compassion to not add to the fire by hating myself for having come into that state. And I would want to both make sure that I'm in the immediate sense safe, let's say from self-harm if the state is really intense, and um, have the conditions, the support, whatever I need to be able to stay mindfully present with this state, because I can't do anything without mindfulness, right? I have to be able to be present with the state as it is, and I have to be protected from harm while I do so. So if those are the foundations of how do I work with a very difficult state in myself, what if those are the exact same foundations for working with a difficult state on the cultural level? So awareness of the state has to arise. We have to actually recognize and name that it's happening, right? So on the cultural level, I see that happening. Lots of people, and again, it's not just individuals doing this, but there's the general sense that there's, a kind of broad understanding present, not universal, in the same way. When I'm in a terrible state, some part of me knows it's a terrible state, and some part of me, you know, righteously and deludedly thinks like, no, I'm just right, and F all y'all, you know? So there's those folks too, right? And so I need to be mindful of it. Here's this important piece about safety and protection. To be mindful of a really intense state, I need to be in a safe enough to work on healing a really intense state or practicing with a really intense state. I need to be in a safe enough situation where I'm protected from harm, from direct physical harm. So, of course, so much of the response work happening in relation to the authoritarian state right now is this kind of protection from harm. Like, yes, I philosophically disagree with the authoritarian impulse. And, you know, here's the phone number that you can call if ICE shows up in your neighborhood. Here's the neighborhood watch. Here's the whistles. This is like first protect. And so I think this is very coherent with a Dharma response. Once there's some protection, and of course this is not linear, but it all has to happen all at once. When there is enough protection from direct harm from the state, what else becomes possible? And one of the things that becomes possible, and I think this is the heart of what moves toward healing in the individual, and it's very hard to do, maybe. I want to be hopeful here, but it's a thing to do on the cultural level. On the individual level, what I need to do with a state is, protect myself, not act on it, right? So there's going to be some renunciation, some will, some like don't speak, don't act, don't do it. And then I need to feel it very deeply, right? To uproot any dukkha in yourself, you have to feel it very deeply. And I have to feel it deeply enough that I, move through the noble truths. I have to really understand the suffering of it, right? And that's going to partly mean understanding its conditions, its karma. I need to know where it came from, what it's doing, what it wants, why it's painful. And then I have to get to the craving. What is it actually trying to do? What is this toxin in me trying to accomplish, right? And what's the emotion underneath that? Like, I'm scared, so I'm clamping down. It's going to be something like this, I'm scared, so I'm angry. You know, I'm confused and I don't know who I am, so I'm lashing out. So on the cultural level, it's going to be the same thing, right? There's going to be some deeper layers that what they are already, right? But like as a larger culture, let's say as a nation, we'll just pause there. It's global, but we'll pause it at the nation at the moment. Let's say the dear United States. What's going on, United States? You know, you're in a really bad way, in this particular way. And if we are in this moment safe enough to reflect and feel the ailment, right? And again, that doesn't mean us as individuals. Again, you can't solve this in the individual body, and we can't solve it in the Sangha body. We can explore it, but what we're looking for here is in what way would we notice that the national culture, let's say, the mean state of the culture is protected from harming itself and others enough that it can feel the suffering that this state is bringing on, you know, and can understand it a bit. And so, some examples of this I see are, some are like electoral, like poll numbers dropping of evil people, um, you know, folks, folks unexpectedly winning, you know, uh, local or regional congressional seats that you know a few years ago would have been impossible for them to win because a lot of people are seeing the harm that's happening. we're looking for if a whole culture in aggregate can be mindful, then a whole culture in aggregate can feel any emotion. And and so I'm looking for the emotion of tenderness and emotions like grief at the karma that's brought us to this moment. I'm looking for emotions like a kind of fierce compassion, an intensity of the the intention for it not to go further in this direction. Sometimes you have to really be strong with yourself and say, it ends with me. Like, we are not going to do this again. Some way that the whole culture could say, wait a minute, like, stop. We know where this story goes. We're not going there. We're not going to repeat, you know, 1940s Germany. We're not going to repeat this or that kind of example that we know from history. And we're not going to repeat aspects of our own history. We're not going to return to being a slave state or, um, or a Christian, ethno-nationalist state, which was the character of some of our earliest colonies, for instance. We're not going to return to that. And so in the same way that on the individual level, it's really work to come into contact with our shadow and with the Saṇkhāras of dukkha, of deep suffering. It is that work uh, in the aggregate as well, in the large cultural body. And so I just want to end by encouraging us to just continue to, if it's interesting, to continue to let this idea, image, metaphor, I'm not sure if it's a metaphor actually, it might just be a true description of things, but to let this model percolate in you around what we might look for and support. And again, how does an individual support national culture? I feel like I'm one neuron in a huge collective mind. But of course, you know, we do, right? You start something on your corner and then 6 neurons show up and then 60 neurons show up. And, and then somebody takes a picture of it with a drone and it shows up on the news. And, like, there is this amplifying quality in the same way that, like, I've had so many conflicting impulses in my life. How did I follow this particular one that led me to teaching the Dhamma, which I think of as a relatively wholesome thing to do? I could have followed any number of unwholesome paths that were appealing, at various moments. And I ended up somehow, like, able to follow, at least in part in my life, this wholesome one. How do we do that as a collective? Not just as individuals, but how do we lean into the collective body, following its wholesome impulses, restraining its most unwholesome impulses, and actually maturing into the kind of letting go and healing that that the Dhamma describes as being possible. The cessation of craving leading to the cessation of suffering. What would it mean to find the cessation of the craving for, let's say, power uh, and protection, which I think are some of the core energies in the authoritarian impulse? What would it mean for the cessation of fear and craving for power to really manifest, right? For the suffering to be understood and the craving to be released? What would an actually wise, awakened society, or at least society in the process of becoming wise and awakening, which ours is, what would that look like as it deepens? All right, so pausing there.